Good evening, folks. Triple Crown here, coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia. This is a round 7 summary, playtest 4 of the Global War 1939 series. And it was what I predicted, because I've been wrong before in my predictions. So I talked about the rule of 10 when going into a large battle that has a fortification. And the dice were probably a little cooler for the Russians than they were for the Germans. And Moscow very handily is in control of the Germans. They survived they only lost 2 aircraft, or some people say that's horrible, but they attacked with 13 and they lost 2 aircraft to AAA fire, and they survived with the entire Luftwaffe that's still hanging around and about 13 armor. So that is a major problem for the Allies to try and maybe take back Stalingrad or put up some kind of defense or stalemate in Russia. So that is a problem. The Germans were worried about the British in Turkey doing something crazy, so they bulked up. So the British could have taken a poke at Bulgaria or Romania, and they would have been successful in that attack. However, the Germans would have had a follow-up, and the British felt it was better just to hold tight in Turkey. They did debate whether or not to send their navy into the Black Sea and do a landing in the Caucasus or over here. However, the fact that the Germans have so many armor left over is anything that was here was going to die next turn, or anything within 2 spaces from Moscow was going to die next turn. So at least the plan for now is to hold tight in Istanbul, which is the territory west of Ankara, which the Germans now have, and they also inherited the Lend-Lease from the Americans to the Russians, so they inherited half. So the Germans have 137 IPP to spend next turn. That's a large amount of money. The Germans, because they were able to capture Moscow, that means Sweden is now pro-Axis. All those purple guys up there, they have not been annexed yet, but that'll be coming probably next turn. So they will inherit a small navy up here. They also turned Spain went pro-Axis, so they went into the northern territory of Barcelona. If you know any Spanish people, I don't know if I said it right, but they say the C with a TH. And the Canadians, and when that happens, Portugal automatically joins the British, similar to BBR. So the 3 ground units and artillery in Portugal, in combination with the Canadians, came down and took out the Spanish and combination Germans, which was a problem. The Canadians and the Portuguese felt they had to do that because if they were able to get into Madrid, they would inherit this little army here and this navy down here. The British also sent their entire air force and every possible unit that could come, including the Portuguese navy, which that was the deciding factor. We forgot about that when they annexed Spain. It looked good at the time. However, not so good for the Italians, who lost their entire navy. They rolled typically how the Italians roll, which was terrible. I think they might have scored 4 or 5 hits. And so that really just sort of took care of the Portuguese navy. And the Americans did do a landing here in Bordeaux they landed with. They lost 1 infantry in the attack, and so they've got 5 remaining and 2 armor. And their now Navy, the German submarines came in here and tried to take a poke at the Russian, British, and American Navy that was sitting here before it wiped out the Italians, and they took about 4 or 5 boats off. They felt they had to do something. So that was a bonus there for the Allies, actually, to get rid of the German Navy. But what else was the German Navy going to do other than sacrifice itself to try and take out as many boats as it could? But maybe it would have been smarter to hold off and now build more Navy. Now they've got this massive armada to spend. The Americans built their Navy from down here, came up, and they built another 5 transports with armor and Marines and infantry to go follow up and do a landing in Western Europe next turn. The Americans did build a bunch of submarines, and some of their Navy that was here decided to come down here and start heading into the Pacific, because currently the Americans have no Navy in the Pacific and they're being convoyed for 15 IPP a turn. The Americans cleaned up all of the, very easily, the remaining Italian and Argentine and Chilean army that was causing a nuisance down here. The British Navy is actually split up now. This Navy is actually just off of Cairo, and this Navy over here is just sitting off of Ankara. So the British did do, they're walking guys up into, at least to try to protect the Middle East, into Baku. And the Japanese decided it was not worthwhile. They were going to lose all of their ground forces, so they decided it was better to hold pat until they had more stuff build up in Szechuan. The Russians, the remaining Russian territories, they've got 18 to spend next turn. The American Lend-Lease did not go through, so now when Moscow does fall, the capital is now Novosibirsk, so they can build there next turn. So it's not all doom and gloom when Moscow falls. I would say it is more so when the Germans survive with their entire air force and tanks. Now, it was a mistake, for the Russians in this game to spend as many resources as they did going into Finland. Now, if the fast movers that had gone into Valpuri and Turin had come back to Moscow, it probably would have still fallen, but the Germans would have been left with maybe, a couple armor and might have had to sacrifice a couple of their airplanes to make sure they captured Moscow. So over here in the FEC, they continue to build up. They're not making the money they once did. They're now down to, I believe, 19 IPP with their bonus. So that is a problem. Down here, the Japanese have taken Dutch New Guinea, or what's this territory here? Dutch East Indies. So they've kept their Navy together. And this fleet is still down here. However, they did send some of their Navy over here. This is the Brazilian battleship, coastal battleship. Actually, it wouldn't have been able to make it. It cannot go across open water, so it's going to have to go back. However, the Japanese wanted to make sure they took this convoy zone. Now, got a message from Captain G about convoy zones we're going to be talking about. But currently, when a convoy zone is raided, that's what it's called, the FEC takes that money away, or it's in effect when they're doing their collect income phase. So the Americans did send some Navy into the Pacific, a cruiser, submarine, and a subchaser, and they built that's all their only build in the Pacific this turn was a subchaser, and they're getting their airplanes in range to maybe support taking out some of these Japanese submarines next turn. The Japanese are still building fast movers on the coast. However, is their objective now going to change? Are they going to try and, go for Sydney, go for Hawaii, or maybe start focusing on Calcutta? That is probably the smarter bet. Now the Chinese are pretty well neutered, or do they want to go and make sure they finish off the Russians and take Novosibirsk? So they're going to have to decide that. And that is the end of round 7, so stay tuned for round 8.